It was a humid night in Fortaleza, the kind that made your skin feel like it was wrapped in a wet blanket, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and sweat. I had lived most of my life in the shadows, never really choosing a side, just existing in the underbelly of this city. But this was something different. I remember the night we met, all of us gathered in that dark warehouse at the edge of town, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead casting long shadows across the grimy floor. I wasn't sure what I was doing there, but I knew one thing. I was in deep, too deep to back out now. The others, they were legends. Some of them had been around for years, making names for themselves in the world of organized crime. Others, they were whispers, like me just trying to survive. But together, we were about to pull off something so big that the world would never forget it. Listen up. The voice of Silva, the man who would lead the job, sliced through the air. He was tall, built like a slab of concrete, with eyes that could freeze you in place. Nobody dared question him. Not now, not ever. This is the job of a lifetime. We're going for the Banco Central. I felt my chest tighten. The Banco Central. Everyone in Fortaleza knew what that place meant. It was the heart of the city's economy. The vaults were said to be impenetrable, secured with layers of high-tech alarms and guards. Only the best of the best ever dared think about robbing it. How the hell are we going to get in there? One of the younger guys asked. His name was Rodrigo, and he looked like he'd never been in a real fight in his life. But there was something about him, a quiet desperation in his eyes that made me think he'd do anything to get out of the life he'd been stuck in. Silva grinned, showing a set of teeth that looked like they'd been filed down 2 points. We're not going through the front door, you idiot. We're going under it. Under it. My mind raced. He couldn't be serious. We've got the tunnel, Silva continued. It's already been dug, just outside the bank's perimeter. You know the plan. We break in, get the money, and get out. Fast. No mess, no blood. That's the deal. My gut twisted. The plan sounded too easy, and every instinct in me screamed that it was too good to be true. But I was here, in this room, surrounded by men who had already crossed lines I hadn't even known existed. If I said no, I'd be dead before the sun came up. So I nodded, even though my insides were screaming for me to run. Any questions? Silva's voice cut through the thick air, his eyes scanning the room. Yeah, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. What's the catch? The room fell silent. Silva's smile faltered just for a moment before it returned, colder than before. The catch is, he said slowly, if any of you screw this up, I will personally bury you alive. We're in this together, and we're not coming back until the job's done. The tension in the room was suffocating. We all knew the risks. None of us were stupid enough to think we were invincible. But that didn't stop the adrenaline from kicking in, making my heart pound in my chest like a drumbeat. I had nothing to lose. Nothing but this job. All right then, Silva said. Let's get to work. The next few days were a blur. Preparations were made in secret. We were all handed new identities, fake paperwork, and tools that would make a thief's dream come true. But the real work, the real planning, was happening underground. I remember the first time I saw the tunnel. It was a cramped hole in the ground, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through. The earth around us, raw and dark. But the thing that stuck with me wasn't the tunnel itself, was the smell, the musty, damp stench of dirt and decay. It made me feel like we were already buried, already dead. We spent hours down there, digging, reinforcing the walls, ensuring it was secure. Every move we made felt like it was setting us on a path from which we couldn't return. I kept telling myself that this was just another job, just another payday. But deep down, I knew this was different. This was the kind of job that would make or break you. The night before the heist, I lay awake on a makeshift cot in the warehouse, staring at the ceiling. My heart thudded in my chest, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me. I thought about the families of the guards at the bank, the people who would be affected if this went wrong. I thought about the lives we were about to destroy, including our own. But when I closed my eyes, I saw the money. Stacks of bills, enough to change everything, enough to disappear. As the clock ticked down, the rest of the gang prepped their gear. Guns, explosives, crowbars, anything and everything we might need. Silver had promised no bloodshed, but deep down, I knew we were all lying to ourselves. At that moment, I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I didn't have a choice. I'd come this far. There was no turning back. Tomorrow, the Banco Central would be ours. The first night of digging felt like something out of a nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and damp earth, the only sounds being the rhythmic scrape of shovels against the ground and the occasional grunt of exertion. Silver had a way of making everything seem like it was just another job. But underneath his calm exterior, I could sense the weight of the operation pressing on him. And I wasn't the only one feeling it. I didn't sleep much those first few nights. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see were the dark shadows of the tunnel stretching endlessly beneath the surface. I was never claustrophobic, but down there, in that cramped, suffocating space, I started to feel like I was buried alive. We were a small crew. Me, Silver, Rodrigo, and a couple of the older guys, Carlos and Renato. Silver was the leader, the mastermind. Carlos was the muscle, tall and broad, with hands that looked like they could crush a man's skull with ease. Renato was the tech guy, the one who had the brains for the gadgets and security systems. Rodrigo, though he was the rookie, a kid who'd barely seen the inside of a real job before, let alone something like this. I couldn't help but watch him as we worked, noticing the way his hands trembled whenever he picked up a tool or looked too long at the dirt beneath his feet. The kid was scared, and I knew that fear would make him either an asset or a liability. No in between. The tunnel was our lifeline. Without it, we wouldn't get in and we wouldn't get out. The plan was simple enough. We would start from an abandoned building, a few blocks away from the Banco Central, and dig a shaft that would take us directly beneath the vault. From there, we'd drill up through the floor of the bank's basement and take what we came for. But the first night of digging it felt like we were chasing a ghost. The dirt was heavy, compacted, and every strike of the shovel seemed to lead us into a new layer of rock. My back ached, my muscles screamed for rest, but Silver wouldn't let us stop. "We don't stop until the tunnel's ready," he'd said, his voice low and commanding. "We don't stop, no matter what." And so we kept digging. On the third night, things got worse. I was exhausted, my hands raw and bloodied from hours of labor. The dirt under our feet started to shift, and I could feel the pressure building. The tunnel, which had once seemed so secure, now felt like it was on the verge of collapse. "Careful," Carlos warned, his deep voice echoing through the narrow shaft. He had been ahead of me, his shovel scraping against the walls as he carved out a new section of the tunnel. The man had a way of sounding calm no matter what. It was probably what had kept him alive this long. "Watch your step. If we hit a soft patch, it'll bring the whole damn tunnel down." I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach, the fear that had started to take hold. We were getting closer. The bank was just on the other side, but every inch we dug felt like we were tempting fate. One mistake, one wrong move, and the whole operation could go to hell. Rodrigo's voice broke the silence, a sharp crack in the otherwise quiet air. "I don't know about this, man. This shit feels wrong." I turned to look at him, my eyes narrowing. "Shut up and dig, Rodrigo." But I could see the panic in his eyes. I had seen it before, in the eyes of men who had never been in a real fight, never faced a life or death situation. I knew he was thinking about bailing, about running out and disappearing, but that wasn't an option now. It had never been an option. "Silva's right," Carlos muttered from ahead. "We do this, or we don't come back." The weight of those words hung in the air like a thick fog. It wasn't just about the money anymore. This wasn't just a robbery. This was survival. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I began to wonder if we were all just digging ourselves into our graves. By the fourth night, we had reached the point where we could feel the temperature change. The air grew heavier, almost stifling, and it wasn't just from the work, it was the anticipation. We were close, so damn close. Every time I swung my shovel into the ground, I imagined the vault on the other side, the riches that lay waiting for us. But that night, something felt off. There was a shift in the air. The tunnel, which had felt solid beneath our feet, now seemed to have grown under the pressure. The walls were slick with moisture, and the deeper we dug, the more unstable it felt. I looked up, catching Silva's eye. He didn't speak. His gaze was fixed ahead, his jaw clenched. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low, like a promise. But it wasn't just the bank we were digging toward. It was our future. It was everything. I felt the weight of it in my chest. As we continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. The air in the tunnel grew thick, oppressive. I could feel it in my bones. And then it happened. The ground trembled beneath our feet. A low rumble echoed through the tunnel. The dirt began to shift, the walls trembling as if the earth itself was alive and angry. "Get back," Carlos yelled. But it was too late. The ceiling cracked and the walls buckled. Dirt rained down, filling the air with choking dust. I gasped for breath as I staggered back, hands raised to shield my face. The tunnel was collapsing. The tunnel collapsed that night. Or rather, it almost collapsed. I couldn't tell you how many times I'd wake up with dirt in my mouth and blood in my hands. We had all scrambled, half-dazed, out of that crumbling tunnel, digging furiously to keep the path open. Silva hadn't allowed a single moment of hesitation. His orders were clear. Keep going, no matter what. He didn't care about the cave-in. He cared about one thing, and one thing only, the bank. We spent the next few days fixing what we could, shoring up the weak spots in the tunnel and reinforcing the walls. Every scrape of the shovel felt like it could be our last. Every creak of the earth above felt like a warning. But as the day of the heist approached, everything seemed to fall into place. The tunnel was ready. We were ready. And as much as I wanted to believe that, as much as I wanted to bury the doubt crawling at the back of my mind, the truth was, nothing had ever felt more wrong. That morning, we gathered in the warehouse, standing around the table with maps, blueprints, and tools spread out in front of us. Silva was already dressed in all black, his face grim as usual. He didn't look like a man about to steal millions from the heart of Fortaleza. He looked like a man ready to kill. "You all know the drill," he said, his voice as cold as the steel in his hand. "We hit the vault, get the money, and get out. No more bullshit, no scriptsy." He looked at each of us as he spoke. his eyes like daggers. It wasn't the first time he'd given this speech, but today his words felt heavier. The tension in the room was thick, the air almost too thick to breathe. I looked around at the others. Rodrigo, his face pale and sweaty. Carlos, nodding as if he had done this 100 times. Renato, quietly fidgeting with the gadgets in front of him, checking and double-checking the plans. We had already done all the preparation. The gear was packed. The fake IDs were in place. The getaway vehicles were ready. The only thing left now was to go. I couldn't ignore the cold shiver that ran down my spine as we stepped out into the daylight. The world felt different today, harsher, more unforgiving. Maybe it was just me. Maybe it was the weight of what was about to happen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The plan was simple. Silva, Carlos, and Renato would enter the bank through the main entrance, disguised as regular customers. Rodrigo and I would stay behind, just out of sight, ready to make the final push into the vault. We had been briefed on every detail: the bank's security, the timing of the alarms, the location of the guards. Everything had been accounted for. We stood outside the Banco Central, watching as the city went about its usual business. People walked by, oblivious to the chaos unfolding beneath their feet. The heat of the morning sun beat down on us, but the anxiety in my chest made it feel like winter. "You all right?" Rodrigo asked quietly, his voice barely audible. He was standing next to me, his hands shaking in the pockets of his jacket. I didn't answer at first. What was there to say? We were on the edge. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. "Just keep your head in the game," I finally muttered, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We're almost there." He nodded, his eyes wide but determined. We waited. Then, as if on cue, the signal came. A subtle nod from Silva across the street, followed by Carlos and Renato entering the bank. It was time. Rodrigo and I made our way to the rear entrance of the building, the cold steel door groaning under our hands as we slowly pulled it open. Our hearts raced in time with our steps as we moved down the narrow hallway. We knew where we needed to be: the basement, just beneath the vault. It wasn't the first time I'd felt the rush of adrenaline coursing through my veins, but this time, it was different. This time, it felt like we were playing with fire. The deeper we went, the tighter the walls seemed to press in on us. The air felt heavier, like something was waiting to happen. I looked over at Rodrigo, who was now sweating through his jacket. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and I could see the fear in his face. But there was something else too, something darker, something that made me wonder if this was the last job for either of us. We reached the basement. Carlos and Renato were already there, setting up the equipment. Renato had his tools in hand, ready to drill through the concrete floor of the vault. Silva's orders had been clear. We would work fast, no mistakes, no delays. There was no time for second-guessing now. "Get in position," Silva had told us when he passed us earlier, his voice low and steady. "We don't have long." I stood next to the drill, watching as Renato expertly positioned it over the spot we needed to hit. There was no going back now. This was it. For a few moments there was only the sound of the drill biting into the concrete. The slow, grinding noise echoed through the room, each second stretching longer than the last. And then something happened. The drill stopped. Renato cursed, his face pale as he turned to the rest of us. "It's stuck," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "The drill's not going through. Something's blocking it." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Time slowed. I could feel the blood drain from my face. "Don't screw this up," Carlos muttered, his voice a low growl. But it was too late. Something had gone wrong. And I knew, in that moment, that it was only a matter of time before the whole thing fell apart. The drill jammed, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch to an unbearable length. The low hum of the machinery that had been working so tirelessly just moments ago was replaced by an eerie silence. We all stood frozen in place, staring at the tool as if it was some kind of omen, a warning we didn't know how to read. Renato cursed again, his hands shaking as he pulled at the drill, trying to free it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the vault was alive, holding us back, testing our resolve. The air felt thick, suffocating, like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare. Carlos was the first to snap. He slammed his fist into the wall with a force that made the entire room shake. "What the hell are you waiting for? Fix it." His voice, usually so calm and controlled, was now tinged with panic. He turned to Renato, his eyes wild. "If we don't get that hole open, we're all dead." Renato didn't need any more urging. He dove into the work, twisting and pulling at the drill with a desperation that only seemed to make the situation worse. Sweat dripped from his forehead, mixing with the dust that had started to fill the room. He was clearly out of his depth. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't supposed to happen. Nothing was supposed to go wrong. I had spent months preparing for this, memorizing every detail of the plan, every step, every contingency. But now it was all falling apart. And I could see it in Rodrigo's eyes. He was starting to lose it too. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "We need to stay calm," I said, my voice coming out rough. "It's just a malfunction. Renato can fix it." But even as I said the words, I knew they sounded hollow. We were already in over our heads, and no amount of calm would fix the sinking feeling in my gut. Carlos paced, his fists clenched at his sides. Silva had been uncharacteristically quiet. I glanced over at him, hoping to find some reassurance in his calm demeanor, but he was staring at the vault, his face unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Renato managed to free the drill. It sputtered back to life, and he quickly repositioned it, his hands shaking as he lined it up with the concrete. The tension in the room was palpable. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. The drill bit into the vault once more, and this time there was no hesitation. It cut through the concrete with a deafening screech, filling the room with the sound of metal on stone. I held my breath, praying it would hold. But then, crack. The sound was sharp, like thunder crashing through the walls. The drill stopped again, but this time it wasn't a simple jam. Something was wrong, something big. "God damn it," Renato screamed, pulling the drill back. His voice cracked with panic. "We've hit something. We can't get through." The room erupted in chaos. Carlos lunged at Renato, grabbing him by the collar. "What do you mean, we can't get through?" he roared, shaking him violently. "This isn't a choice, Renato. You fix it." The air was thick with tension, each of us watching the exchange with bated breath. Silva had yet to speak, but his eyes were darting between the drill and the vault, calculating, evaluating. I could see the wheels turning in his mind. Renato was visibly trembling, his face pale with fear. "There's a metal barrier inside the vault," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not just concrete. Whoever built this place knew what they were doing. They added an extra layer of reinforced steel." I felt my stomach drop. My mind raced. We hadn't accounted for this. We hadn't planned for an extra layer of security, and we certainly hadn't accounted for the fact that it could stop us in our tracks. For a moment, everything felt as if it was slipping through my fingers. The plan had been perfect. We'd thought of everything. At least, I thought we had. "Silver," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what do we do now?" He looked at me, his eyes cold and calculating. His lips twisted into a thin line, but he didn't say anything at first. He was weighing the options in his head. "Get the torch," he finally said. His voice was firm, unwavering. We burned through the steel. It was a risky move. Using a cutting torch to burn through the steel would take time, and we didn't have much of that. The clock was ticking. The alarms could go off at any moment. Every second we spent in the vault was a second closer to being caught. But there was no other choice. I nodded and moved toward the tools. Rodrigo was already there, hands shaking as he picked up the cutting torch. The thing looked like a weapon, a giant, heavy cylinder with a nozzle at the end that could melt through almost anything. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, my heart racing. "It's going to take too long." Silver's gaze was steely, unwavering. "We don't have a choice. We do it, or we walk away empty-handed. And you know, that isn't an option." He was right. It wasn't an option. We couldn't walk away now, not after everything we'd been through. Rodrigo set to work, carefully aligning the nozzle of the torch with the steel barrier. The heat from the flame was intense, enough to make the air around us shimmer and distort. The torch's roar filled the room as the metal began to glow red hot, melting away beneath the intense heat. Sweat poured down my back as I watched, my heart in my throat. I could feel the walls of the bank closing in on us. Every noise seemed amplified in the tense silence, footsteps echoing in the halls above us. The distant sound of traffic, the heartbeat of the entire city moving around us, oblivious to the chaos unfolding just beneath their feet. But then, just as the flame reached the metal barrier, something else happened. A soft beep, then another and another. My blood ran cold. It was the alarm. The bank's silent alarm had been triggered. We had been made. The beep of the alarm echoed in my ears like a death sentence. The sound, once faint, grew louder and louder until it felt like the entire world was ringing with it. My heart raced in my chest, each beat more frantic than the last. The whole damn plan was falling apart in front of our eyes, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. "Shit," Carlos spat, his voice sharp with panic. "We've been made." Silver was the first to react, his face as calm as ever. But I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Was it fear, doubt, maybe even a hint of panic? He quickly turned to Renato, who was still holding the cutting torch, his face pale and sweaty. "Get that metal cut," Silver ordered, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We don't have much time." But Renato didn't move. He was frozen, staring at the glowing red steel barrier, his hands trembling. I could see it in his eyes. He knew we were running out of time. The alarm was already in the system, and it wouldn't take long for the authorities to figure out where we were. "We need to hurry," I said, stepping forward, my voice tight with fear. I could feel the walls closing in around me. The fear was suffocating, and I was struggling to hold it together. Renato snapped out of his daze and resumed cutting through the steel. The sound of the torch was deafening, and the heat from the flame made the air shimmer in front of my face. Each second that passed felt like an eternity. I kept glancing nervously at the door, my hand hovering near my gun. The tension was unbearable. I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears, the sweat pouring down my back. The heat from the torch and the fear of getting caught was like a vice around my chest. Every second that passed felt like it could be our last. Carlos moved to the window, peering out nervously. "There's a car outside," he muttered. "It looks like a cop car." A cold wave of panic washed over me. The authorities were already here. The game was up. "We're not out yet," Silver said, his voice low, but there was an edge to it now, sharpness that wasn't there before. "Finish cutting through the damn steel. We're going to make this work." I looked over at Rodrigo. He was standing off to the side, his eyes wide with fear. I knew exactly what he was thinking. There was no escape. Not now. We were trapped. But Silver wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Beep. Another beep. Closer this time. My stomach dropped. It was the sound of the silent alarm feeding back into the security system, notifying the bank's security office. The longer the alarm kept going off, the sooner the police would show up in force. Renato, sweat pouring down his face, gave one final push on the torch. The steel barrier glowed white-hot as the flame cut deeper, burning through metal like paper. Finally, there was a hiss and a pop as the steel melted away, and Renato pulled back, breathing heavily. His face strained from the heat. "We're in," he said, his voice hoarse, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a warning. We moved quickly, pushing through the now open gap in the vault. Inside, the piles of money stacked high on metal shelves gleamed under the harsh lights, tempting us with its promise of wealth. For a moment, I almost forgot about the police, the alarm, the risk. For just a split second, I thought we might actually get away with it. But then, the real sound came. The unmistakable sound of sirens, cutting through the air like a knife. The police were closing in. "Shit, shit," Carlos yelled. "We need to go now." Silver grabbed a stack of cash and shoved it into a bag, his movements frantic. His eyes were wild, and for the first time, I saw something in him that I hadn't before, sense of desperation. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival. "Everyone, move," Silver barked. "We've got 10 minutes, maybe less. Get the rest of the cash, now." There was no time to waste. We all rushed to grab what we could, shoving money into bags, piling it up without any sense of order. The sound of sirens grew louder, closer. I could hear the faint shouts of police officers outside, their voices too distant to understand, but growing steadily louder. Rodrigo grabbed a handful of bills and ran toward the exit. "Let's go, now." But as we moved to leave, the door to the vault suddenly slammed shut. Click, a heavy, metallic sound. We stopped dead in our tracks. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The door to the vault had locked, but how? A voice crackled through the combs. "We've got a lock-in situation," came the voice of the man who had been monitoring the bank's security feed. He sounded calm, like he already knew what was coming. "The authorities are coming through the front. You won't make it out in time." I froze. The door to the vault was locked. The alarms were blaring. The police were outside. We were trapped. "Get it open," I shouted, my voice rising with panic. "We need to get out now." But it was too late. The vault door was locked. The sound of the heavy, metallic click echoed in my ears, reverberating through my chest like a death knell. The sirens outside grew louder, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. We had done everything we could, and now we were trapped inside the vault with nowhere to go. "Fuck," Carlos shouted, slamming his fist against the steel door. "We're screwed. We're fucking screwed." Silver didn't flinch. He was calm. He turned to me, his eyes cold and calculating, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man who had masterminded this entire heist. He wasn't panicking, and I hated him for it. Because in the back of my mind, I knew that Silva had already accepted what was coming. "We're not dead yet," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "We can still make it out, but we need to think fast." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that thinking fast wasn't enough. We didn't have time to think. The cops were coming, the vault door was sealed, and we were sitting ducks. "Get us out of here," I snapped, panic creeping into my voice. "Do you have any ideas, Silva? Because I sure as hell don't." Silva glanced at the rest of the crew, Renato, Rodrigo, Carlos, and then back at the door. The calmness in his face never wavered, but I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "I have an idea," he said slowly, his voice steady, but there was something dark in his eyes, something calculating. "But we need to work together. No room for mistakes." He motioned for Renato to approach, and the two of them started examining the door mechanism. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Every second that passed was a second closer to being caught. The air inside the vault was thick with the smell of sweat and fear, and I could feel it pressing against my skin, suffocating me. "Talk to me, Silva," I urged. "What's the plan?" Silva didn't answer at first. He was too focused on the door, his eyes narrowed as he inspected the lock. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he looked up. "There's a secondary lock," he said quietly. "It's a backup system. We've triggered the main alarm, but there's another way out if we can disable this lock. We can access the emergency exit." A faint glimmer of hope sparked in my chest. "How do we disable it?" Silva motioned to Renato. "It's a manual override. If we can get to the control panel, we can short-circuit it. But we'll need to move fast. The police are already outside. They'll be here any minute." Renato nodded, his face pale, his hands shaking. He wasn't the calmest under pressure, but there was no time to argue. We had to act now. "We don't have much time," I said, trying to push my fear aside. "We do this now, or we die in here. Understand?" Everyone nodded, and for the first time in what felt like hours, there was a sense of unity. We didn't have the luxury of fear anymore. We didn't have the luxury of hesitation. The control panel was located behind a thick, reinforced metal wall, tucked away in a corner of the vault. It wasn't easy to access, but with all of us working together, we managed to clear a path. Renato set to work immediately, his hands fumbling as he tried to open the panel. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. Outside, the sirens were deafening now. I could hear the wail of police cars getting closer, the sharp screech of tires, the faint hum of helicopters overhead. The sound was a constant reminder that we were running out of time. "We don't have much left," Carlos said, his voice strained. "If we don't get this thing open in the next 5 minutes, I know." I cut him off. "I know." But the truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know what we were going to do. If the secondary lock didn't give, if Renato couldn't get through the control panel, then we would have no way out, and the police would be waiting for us on the other side. Renato's hands were shaking more than before, his fingers moving faster now, desperately trying to disarm the system. Sweat dripped down his face as he pulled at wires, twisting them in ways that seemed more like luck than skill. Come on," he muttered under his breath. Suddenly, there was a click, and the panel sparked to life. "Got it," Renato whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no time to celebrate. The control panel blinked green, and the secondary lock disengaged with a loud thunk. A rush of relief surged through me just for a moment. We still had to get to the emergency exit, and that was no guarantee. But we had one shot. "Move," Silva barked. "We take the exit, now." We bolted for the far side of the vault, where the emergency door was located. The thick steel door was hidden behind a false wall, and it took all of us working together to pull it open. The metal groaned under the strain, but we managed to get it open just wide enough to slip through. The moment we stepped into the narrow hallway beyond, the stench of sweat and panic clung to the air. The sound of the sirens was deafening now, too close for comfort. The police were almost here. We had to move faster. "We take the back entrance," Silver said, his voice sharp. "The van's waiting. Move." We sprinted down the hallway, the heavy bags of cash weighing us down. The sound of our footsteps echoed, harsh and frantic, in the narrow corridor. But it was the sound of the sirens, the ever-present reminder that we weren't free, that kept me moving, kept me pushing forward. But then, just as we reached the back exit, everything froze. The door was wide open, the lights flickering above us, casting long, eerie shadows down the alley. And then I heard it. A voice: "Drop your weapons." We froze. My heart slammed into my chest. There, standing at the end of the alley, was a line of officers. And standing at the front, holding a gun, was the last person I ever expected to see. My blood ran cold the moment I saw him. Standing there at the end of the alley, a gun aimed directly at us, was none other than Lucas, our inside man. He had been the one who fed us all the intel, who set up the heist, who assured us that everything would go smoothly. And now, as the flashing red and blue lights from the police cars illuminated the alleyway, it was clear that he had betrayed us. "Lucas," Silver hissed, his eyes narrowing. "You sold us out." Lucas didn't flinch. He stood there like a statue, his face unreadable, the gun still steady in his hands. His eyes cold, calculating, glanced briefly over the rest of us before landing on Silver. "You should have known, Silver," Lucas said, his voice low and steady. "You never trust anyone outside the circle. I've been with the cops for weeks, feeding them everything." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The adrenaline, the fear, it all came crashing down on me. Every plan we'd made, every calculation, was pointless. Lucas had been playing us from the start. He knew exactly what we were doing and had ensured we'd be cornered at the worst possible moment. "You sold us out for what?" Carlos growled, his voice rising with fury. "For a paycheck." Lucas's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no humor in it. "More than that, I'm walking away from this. You're not. I made my choice." The sirens grew louder, closer. The police were on their way in. We had no time to argue, no time to plead. The game had changed, and now survival was our only option. Silver took a step forward, his hand still gripping his gun. "You think they'll let you walk? You're in deeper than we are, Lucas. You're not going anywhere." Lucas shook his head slowly. "I already told you, Silver, I'm done." He raised his gun, pointing it directly at us, his finger hovering near the trigger. "The only way this ends is if you all go down with me. It's over." The weight of his words hit me like a slap. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a trapper, well-planned, well-executed trap that had been set from the very beginning. Lucas had been waiting for us to make our move, and now, at the worst possible moment, he was pulling the strings, forcing us to face the consequences of our actions. "Drop your weapons," one of the officers shouted from behind Lucas, his voice muffled by the distance. We didn't move. None of us dared to. If we dropped our guns, we were done for. But if we raised them, we would be met with 100 officers swarming the alley. We were stuck, caught between two impossible choices. Then I heard the sound of footsteps behind us, fast, heavy footsteps. A figure appeared from the shadows, and for a split second, I thought it was another cop. But as the figure stepped into the light, I realized it was Rodrigo, and his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Rodrigo, what the hell are you doing?" Silva barked. Rodrigo didn't answer. He just moved closer, his hand gripping something tightly in his pocket. A gun. I could see the glint of metal in the low light. But this wasn't just any gun, it was a backup, the kind we kept hidden for emergencies. Lucas's eyes flicked to Rodrigo, and in that moment, I saw the hesitation in his stance, the smallest crack in his otherwise impenetrable resolve. It was all the opening we needed. Without a word, Rodrigo pulled out the gun and fired. The shot rang out, loud and sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Lucas flinched, his body jerking back, but the bullet didn't hit him. It struck the ground next to him, just inches from his foot. "Run," Silva yelled. "Move, now." The alley exploded into chaos. We bolted. The sound of our feet pounding the pavement echoed behind us as we sprinted down the alley, the weight of the stolen money still clutched tightly in our hands. The gunfire had thrown everything into disarray, but it had also given us a chance, a fleeting moment of opportunity to escape. "Go, go, go," Silva shouted, pushing us forward. Rodrigo was right behind us, his face still pale, his hands shaking, but his gun was ready. Carlos and Renato were in front, making their way toward the end of the alley. We could see the exit just a few hundred yards away. The police were still following us, but they hadn't caught up yet. We had a small lead, a tiny window of hope, but that window was closing fast. The sound of gunfire echoed again this time, not from us. The police had opened fire, and the shots rang out behind us, narrowly missing as we rounded the corner and dove into the street. "Split up," Silva ordered. "We'll meet at the van. Don't stop." We didn't hesitate. We split, scattering in every direction, each of us hoping we could lose the police, each of us praying that our paths wouldn't cross again. But the fear, the overwhelming, suffocating fear, made it hard to think, hard to breathe. I ran down the alley, my mind racing, my thoughts spinning. What had we done? We had followed Silva's plan, trusted Lucas, and now we were all running for our lives. The police would catch up. They had to. The game was rigged from the start. As I turned a corner, I nearly collided with a wall of officers. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. But just as they closed in, I saw it, the van. A black, nondescript van parked on the other side of the street, the engine running. Silva's voice echoed in my mind. "We'll meet at the van." I sprinted towards it, adrenaline fueling my every step. I could hear the officers shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. The van was the only chance I had. The van was just ahead, its engine humming in the night. My lungs burned from the sprint, each breath sharp and ragged, but I couldn't stop. Not now, not when we were this close. I reached the van in seconds, the cold air rushing past me as I slid into the side door. Silva was already inside, his face tight with determination, his eyes scanning the street. The others followed, each of us breathing hard, our hearts pounding in our chests. Renato was the last to arrive, his legs unsteady as he staggered into the van, slamming the door shut behind him. He looked like he had seen a ghost, his face pale, his hands shaking as he gripped the back of the seat. "Go," Silva shouted at the driver, and the van lurched into motion. But the moment we moved, I knew something was wrong. The van didn't drive off in a smooth escape. Instead, it swerved, skidding on the wet street as it fought against the weight of the getaway. I glanced over at the rearview mirror. Their police cars were in pursuit, and they were closing in faster than I thought. The lights flickered, red and blue, a constant reminder that this wasn't over yet. "Step on it." Silver yelled at the driver again, his voice sharp with urgency, but no one was ready for what happened next. A sudden, loud bang echoed through the vans. Something hit the back window. The glass didn't shatter, but I heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped my head around to see Lucasy was there. He had tracked us down, and now he was taking shots at us. Betrayed at every turn, we were now trapped between the law and Lucas' vendetta. It wasn't just the cops we had to worry about anymore. It was him. "Lucas, you bastard." Carlos screamed from the back of the van, his voice laced with fury. But Lucas didn't care. He kept firing, his shots aimed at our tires, at the engine. The van was shaking from the impact, and I could hear the tires screeching as they lost air. "We need to lose him." Silver barked, his knuckles white on the edge of his seat. "Take the alleyway, now." The driver jerked the wheel, pulling the van hard left into a narrow alley. The tires squealed as they scraped against the asphalt. The alley was tight, barely enough room to maneuver. But we had no choice. If we stayed out in the open, we were dead. And then it happened. A sudden crash as Lucas hit the side of the van with his car. The impact sent a shock through my body, knocking me into the seat next to me. For a split second, everything felt like it was in slow motion. My vision blurred, my head spinning. But Silver wasn't slowing down. "Keep it steady," Silver shouted at the driver. We veered left again, nearly clipping a streetlight, and the van roared forward. The tires screamed in protest, but we were faster now, the alley opening up ahead. I looked out the rearview mirror. Lucas was still on our tail, his car inching closer, too close for comfort. "We need a distraction," Renato said, his voice shaking, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "We need something to stop him." I turned to him, a dark thought crossing my mind. The bags of money we'd stolen were still in the back of the van, heavy and stacked. And then I remembered the backup guns, the ones we'd kept for emergencies, the ones Lucas had known about. "We throw the money out," I said, the words spilling out before I could think better of them. "We throw it into the street. The cops will stop for it. Lucas will think we dropped the cash." It was a desperate plan, but at this point, what choice did we have? "Do it," Silver growled. We didn't hesitate. Renato jumped into action, grabbing one of the bags and throwing it out of the rear doors. The bag hit the street with a heavy thud, and as it rolled, the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have. The van lurched forward, but Lucas saw the bag. He swerved in pursuit, taking the bait. The sirens of the police cars were still behind us, but now they had a target. "Go, go, go," Silver shouted, urging the driver on. We had a split second, and it was all we needed. We took another sharp corner, this time towards a quiet residential street. The sirens seemed to fade as we gained speed. The sound of Lucas's car grew more distant. We were in the clear, for now. But just as the tension started to ease, the sound of police helicopters filled the air, their blades slicing through the quiet night like a swarm of angry bees. My heart dropped into my stomach. The cops were still out there. They hadn't given up, and we were running out of time. "We're not home free yet," Silver said, his voice low. "We keep going until the heat dies down. We need to ditch the van." The driver nodded, making another sharp turn and taking us deeper into the city. The helicopters were still overhead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before they pinpointed our location. Minutes felt like hours. The tension in the van was suffocating as we waited for the inevitable moment when the cops would catch up. when the helicopters would zero in on us, and when our luck would run out. Finally, the driver pulled off the main road, taking us to a warehouse district. The dark, abandoned buildings loomed ahead, casting long shadows. We weren't far from the city's edge now. A few more turns, and we would be out of sight. "Pull in here," Silver ordered. The van skidded to a stop in front of an old, run-down building. The paint was chipped, the windows cracked. It was perfect. The plan was simple: now split up, burn the van, and disappear into the night. We filed out of the van in a rush, the bags of cash still with us. As we moved into the shadows of the warehouse, the helicopter's searchlights cut through the air, sweeping over the streets nearby. We ducked low, blending with the darkness. "Keep your heads down," Silver whispered, "and don't stop running." I looked back one last time, the sounds of sirens and helicopters fading into the distance. We had done it, or had we? The story ends here, leaving the fate of the gang up in the air. Did they escape for good, or will their actions come back to haunt them? The future is uncertain, but one thing is clear: the consequences of their choices will follow them forever.